Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 2 of Real Talk with Shan and Bilal.
This is Bilal. That was Shan.
Yes, it was. And in our second episode of getting us up to speed of what's been going on since the Trump election, our second episode titled Muslims, Mexicans, and Mobs, we talk about the rise of Trump's several travel bans, the mob violence that has made the fringe elements in both the right side and the left side of the political spectrum less fringy, and we also talk about the controversial acts and pardons imposed by President Donald Trump that have to do with the oppression of Mexicans in this country.
So, don't smack me for saying this, but I guess you could say the protests were really fringy and really cringy. There you go.
Okay.
That was okay.
That was something. That was okay.
Okay, so as Sean mentioned, topic 1 is going to be the rise of the protesters, and then topic number 2 is going to be the executive orders 13769 and 13780. But before we even get into that, I would like to say thank you to everyone who has been helping us. We obviously had a couple of our friends, some teachers that are helping us grow this podcast. We just want to give a shout out to them really quickly. Okay, so now, first, what was the purpose and ultimate goal of the protesters of the Trump presidency during the early days? So as you know, Trump was inaugurated on January 20th, and then I think by that Friday, definitely by that weekend, Washington, D.C. was covered in March Against Trump and the women's protest. And the women's protest, I think especially, is something interesting to look at, because that was one of the largest protests in Washington, D.C. in history. The backlash for that was obviously coming from his history of sexually assaulting women. I think the biggest one that was around the time of the election was the release of the what was it? It wasn't MTV, Access Hollywood.
Yeah, it was Access Hollywood.
Access Hollywood. Those tapes. So I think that had the biggest. That was the impetus of this. That's why everyone got really riled up about it. And do you think there are going to be protests, even if that let's say that there was no history of sexual assault? Do you think that there still would have been a women's protest, or do you think people are still just mad enough in general to protest against Trump?
I don't think it would have been a women's march. I think it would have been just a protest in general. I don't think it would have been just women specifically protesting had he not had a history of sexual assault against women, especially if the Access Hollywood tape had not been released at the time at which it had. So I think people would have found a reason to protest his inauguration anyway, because he's such a fringy element in the Republican Party. He's a fringy element in politics in general, because he never held political office before he ran, and all of a sudden he defeats one of the biggest insiders in Washington political history, just like that. A person who took politics as a hobby, beating a woman who was First Lady for 8 years, who was the First Lady of Arkansas, who was a Washington lawyer, who was in the Nixon trials. She was present in the Nixon trials as a lawyer, senator after Bill Clinton's term as president ended, and then Secretary of State under President Barack Obama in his first term. And then this guy who just chose politics as a hobby to just say F you and point a middle finger to all the people who represented Washington insiders as well as Hillary Clinton had, that really did piss off a bunch of people.
So she was definitely a venerable woman. What I think was, especially, you brought up how much experience she had as First Lady, as a lawyer, as a senator. I think that if it had been, let's say it was Joe Biden, okay? And let's say, once again, that there's no Access Hollywood tapes. I think that the protests wouldn't have been as widely covered, because especially in the 2008 primaries, what we saw, I think Obama's race, it was interesting. The first African American president obviously was a major thing. I don't think that was the main reason I think he got nominated. I just think you have a woman going against a man. I think America realized it's more sexist than it is racist. And I think that's kind of what carried over now.
Not even that, but you have to understand the context at which Obama was elected. It was 2008. Yeah. We were knee-deep in the Great Recession, and
it was going to be a Democrat.
It was going to be a Democrat, and on top of that, Hillary Clinton was seen as an insider Democrat who chose to triangulate her position with the Republicans as her husband did. Now, triangulation, for those of you who don't know, is when
dab up on him with those complicated terms. That's good. Give on.
So triangulation is basically when a member of one party chooses to appease the divided political situation that may be present in the House of Representatives and Congress and in the executive branch as well. and reaches over to members from the other party and makes deals with them. That's what Trump has been doing with the Democrats, in fact, for the past couple of weeks. That's basically what triangulation is. And she triangulated a lot with House and Senate Republicans, mostly Senate Republicans, just as President Bill Clinton did with people like Newt Gingrich when he was president. And that's why people saw her as responsible, as one of the people responsible for the Wall Street crash. Because the government essentially enabled Wall Street to perform unspeculative behaviors, issue out toxic CDOs and subprime loans that caused the collapse of the housing market. And the fact that the government, with Democrats like Barney and a bunch of Republicans that opposed any form of Wall Street reform because of the fact that they had big donors, people saw Hillary Clinton as contributing to that mess. And that is another reason why, on top of the sexism that Bilal is mentioning, I think this was more prevalent. And that's why they had Obama put on a higher pedestal, because they thought he was doing something to stop the these speculative behavior that was going on in Wall Street.
Yo, I think Sean hit it. He hit the nail on the head. Like, Hillary Clinton, along with her husband Bill Clinton, but I think even more so, was the epitome of the new Democrat. Like, their economics are basically in terms of like health. Obviously, the big thing that they had difference on was the bailout of 2009. But besides that, most of their economic policies are pretty center, so they can work with the Republicans on that.
Exactly.
So when you had Bill Clinton come in, and then during the primary process, the New Democrats had their rebirth after 8 years of Bush. She was basically like, I'm not going to focus on economic policies because Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are going to tear me a new asshole. But I'm going to focus on, I'm going to focus on the social issues, right?
Yeah.
That's how she tried to differentiate herself. She was like, Bernie Sanders. First, she tried to accuse Bernie Sanders of being a Jew, and that wouldn't get him elected.
Not only that, but if you look at 2008, she wouldn't quit the race until after Obama won the Democratic primary.
He got the delegates, and then she was like, I'm not going to back out for a couple of days. And it took her like 4 days after Obama was like basically the presumptive nominee.
Obama was calling super delegates from before the primaries even kicked off in its full flow, and she ended up calling them like at the time when he secured most of his super delegates, when he basically had the delegates to win the Democratic primary. And in addition to that, she said a bunch of really shady things directed towards
shady
Obama.
woman.
Yeah, she's a very shady woman. And you have to, one of the things that she said in one of the interviews, I forgot who it was with, I think it was like Howard Stern or something. I forgot who it was, but she said, hey, I'll stay in the race. I'll stay in the race because of the fact that Robert Kennedy got shot. Robert Kennedy got shot even though he was the presumptive nominee. So I want to stay in the race just in case something happens. She insinuated to the death of the potential presumptive Democratic nominee.
Wait, my man, you're never going to believe this. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote of the 2008 primaries. Barack Hussein Obama got 17.5 votes. Million votes. She got 17.8. Dude, this woman just can't catch a break.
Oh my goodness.
How many that's depressing. He won because of the delegates.
He won because of the delegate. Yeah, because he knew what to win. He went after the people who would definitively give him the win. He went after the super delegates before Hillary Clinton even contemplated it. She thought the popular vote would save her. She did that twice now.
That's fucking gold. She won the popular vote again. Dude, I think she just doesn't have. She wins those like liberal like centers really well. Like she wins California really well. If you're looking at the map of the 2008 primaries, she won California, areas of Texas, Florida. Like the three bastions of at the time were obviously like California, New York, and Pennsylvania. At the time, those were the bastions of the Democratic Party, and she won all of those. So Barack Obama won the Deep South, and he won west of the Mississippi. He won most of west of the Mississippi. If you go west of the Mississippi, north of the Mason-Dixon line, he won that handedly.
Yeah.
Except, that's like South Dakota.
Exactly. Okay, now going back to our topic, one of the questions that we
go off
posed.
on a lot of tangents. So.
Yeah, we do.
Oh, yeah, go.
Good enough. I mean, we're talking about substantive issues. All right, what role did the mass protests play in the progression and presentation of the right and left? What do you think?
I think right at the beginning of it, right? You didn't have Antifa. Right, I'm talking about within 2 months, Antifa was starting to protest. But at the initial time, you only had March Against Trump and you only had the women's protest, right?
Yeah.
So you have those two. In terms of morals, right? I think it was relatively defensible. Like the March Against Trump, they were able to go against his domestic policies, go against his foreign policies, go against him as a politician. And then, so they got like the political side, and then women's protest, they got like the social side. Like they were able to say, morally, in terms of how he treats women, in terms of how he's going to handle gender relations, he's going to do extremely poorly. So that's what they carried. So initially, they had both sides covered. Now, in terms of the right, they had like counter protests, and I don't think the left obviously has devolved. They now have protests that are just as horrendous as the right.
Yeah.
But at the time, the left, I think, was on the higher ground in terms of their ability to protest. They had the reasons. They were able to defend it, at least at the time. But over the next couple of months, it basically fell apart.
Exactly. And I just want to give light to a bit of history about Antifa. Antifa began as a 1920s anti-fascist movement against people like Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and a bunch of autocrats in Europe. So they were really protesting against people who were fascist, and they employed militaristic guerrilla tactics. Essentially, starting from the 70s and 80s, that's when it really started coming into the United States, masked as just anti-fascism. But the organization Antifa, with the logo that they had employed, the logo that we see in places where they're most active, say Berkeley, now Charlottesville, that they've employed militaristic tactics to prevent another Unite the Right rally. That organization really began in the 70s and 80s, because that's when they really started to organize, and that's when they really started to employ military tactics to prevent an uprising on the right. And that, essentially, from my point of view, further exacerbates tensions between the fringy movements of the right and the left, and it seeps into our popular culture the way it has, and it makes it less fringy.
The one thing I'd say regarding Antifa protest, obviously we're going to cover Charlottesville, I think, like episode 5. So we'll get there eventually. But I think the one thing that should be noted, people on the left generally have denounced Antifa. Like you have like some of the fringe groups, like the Young Turks, who we like generally. But they're definitely, okay, not Sean, but myself. I generally agree with them on the issues, not how they should be dealt with. Like they're thinking that, we're going to get a constitutional. You can't get a constitutional amendment done by the states. You just can't. But anyway, that's another topic.
Yeah.
Like Trevor Noah, he has said that Antifa is vegan ISIS.
Vegan ISIS, yeah.
And Trevor Noah, he's a very popular man. Now, that's just an example. He's a talk show host. But it goes to the idea of the issue. People are denouncing Antifa on the left. I don't see as many people denouncing the KKK and the neo-Nazis on the right. Like Trump was like, there's bad people on both sides.
No, the thing about that is Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Melania Trump, these people denounced it even before the Unite the Right rally exacerbated into what it became known as, 19 injured, 1 dead. Before that, they did denounce it. Now, the problem is the person sitting in the Oval Office was very hesitant on denouncing it at first glance. He said, we oppose hatred, bigotry on many sides. All right, the thing about that is both sides initiated violence in certain aspects, but both sides didn't initiate bigotry. Now, as much as I freaking hate Antifa, everyone should hate Antifa. Everyone with the same freaking mind.
Quick question. Are we calling it Antifa or Antifa? Or does it not matter?
I don't even know. Yeah, I don't really care. But the thing is, okay, so the general idea is both sides did not instigate bigotry. One side has instigated bigotry since the late 19th century, and the other side is just a bunch of violent pussies who basically came from their mom's basements after masturbating every night and watching InfoWars.
Eat them up. Keep going.
Those are the kinds of people that Antifa are. Now, I think they're absolutely irrelevant, and as soon as you point a gun at them, then they'll run away and whine like a bunch of pussies that they are.
Oh boy.
The thing about neo-Nazis and the KKK and like the general alt-right are the white supremacists. I don't like the name alt-right because it paints a negative picture of the right as a whole. I'm just going to call them what they actually are, white supremacists. People like Jared Taylor, Richard Spencer, David Duke, these are the people that actually instigate bigotry in our diverse nation. And these are the people that we should be combating. And it was very perturbing to see the president not denounce them at first glance. Even during the primary season, if many of you may recall, Trump didn't know, well, he claimed to have not known who David Duke even was in an interview with Bill O'Reilly on Fox News.
Everyone knows who David Duke is.
He even knew who David Duke was. In 2000, I believe it was, when he was running for president. Yeah, he ran for president in 2000 on the Reform Party ticket. He even called David Duke a despicable human being. And all of a sudden, 16 years later, he doesn't remember who David Duke is when he is in his most prominent. David Duke even ran for senator in 2016, praising Donald Trump for the kind of perceived anti-immigrant stance that Trump had. Now, the thing is, you can't say someone's a despicable human, and no matter how many years afterwards, you all of a sudden forget who they are, even though you have some of the biggest business connections in the world. And just social connections, political connections in general. So it was very perturbing to see that development.
But going back to I think we're kind of getting like a little bit too far ahead. If we're going back to the immediate aftermath, can I call it aftermath? It sounds like a war broke out, like Washington D.C. burned to the aftermath of the Battle of Trump's inauguration. Anyway,
the Battle of the Electoral College.
The Battle of the Electoral College. That's glorious. Oh, dude, hard-fought delegates, man. Rest in peace.
Rest in peace. Press up.
Press up to pay respects. But going back to immediately what followed Trump's inauguration, and dude, I think the left that was the most organized the left has been in terms of protesting. Yeah. Since then, there have been some for impeachment, not going to happen for at least 2 years. There have been some for Medicare for all. Bernie Sanders, that's legislation. That's just politics. You can't protest at town halls because there are no town halls. You can't protest tax reform because they're not talking about tax reform. So the only protests that they can do are against Trump rallies. So at the time, there was no Trump rally, so they were like, okay, this will be our moment to shine. And then they blow it out of the park. They do so well in terms of protests. For a week and a half, the only thing on the news is what they're doing. Now, if you want to, the second question that we posed was, what specific instance gave rise to the aggressive Antifa movement, or was it part of natural progression as both sides gained radicalized factions? I think it was kind of just a reaction. There was a sharp veer to the left. The Tea Party had it earlier, and later on the Tea Party kind of merged. I'm not saying the Tea Party had nothing to do with the KKK. I don't want myself to be misinterpreted. But at some point, the neo-Nazis hijacked the Tea Party. So they used that as their defensive platform, that as their political shield. You can't just make fun of the Tea Party, they're just protesting. So I think that's what gave rise to the neo-Nazis. Mm-hmm. Antifa did the same thing. They were looking for an excuse, like the neo-Nazis were looking for an excuse.
Exactly.
So Antifa used March Against Trump and the women's protest. They said, it's not that we can peacefully protest, is your constitutional right. They thought we need to violently protest, like anarchy, effectively. They want to go against what they viewed to be fascism. So they protested. So it was just an immediate reaction. It was people that just wanted an excuse, basically.
Yeah. Exactly. I have nothing much to add to that. Exactly. He hit the nail right on the head when he was talking about that.
I'll dab up on him. Part two.
So, do you think you can make a logical comparison between Antifa on the left and the white supremacists, not alt-right, white supremacist neo-Nazis on the right? Do you think that they can be put on the same moral ground?
I think they can definitely be, in terms of if we're talking about moral ground as in the gutter, then yeah. There's no way you can possibly say that one is better than the other because they're basically doing the same thing to reach a very similar goal. The neo-Nazis, they want to use violence and aggression to silence the voice of the left. The Antifa wants to use violence and aggression to silence the voice of the right. So it's the exact same reasoning. It's just what side of the political spectrum you're on that's different.
Exactly. And I just like to add on to that. In terms of bigotry, one's obviously worse than the other historically. But in terms of violence, they both instigate violence.
Which one did you say historically is the one worse than bigotry?
The KKK.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Come on, man.
Yeah.
But in terms of violence, they've both instigated violence on many, many, many instances in the past. Especially now. I mean, Antifa's really dominating that violence specter because of the fact that they're just blindly protesting events that have nothing to even do with fascism. I mean, on September 14th, Ben Shapiro, very syndicated columnist,
he spoke at
university, right?
Yeah,
he spoke at UC Berkeley. He talked about campus thuggery. Not even just campus thuggery. That was the title of his lecture, but mainly he was talking about a wide spectrum of issues. and he gave a very conservative, very moderate stance on it if you watch the entire speech. But I doubt very many people who were part of Antifa even bothered to show up. And I think there were, I believe, 7 people arrested for mindlessly causing violence, for thinking he's a white supremacist, putting up signs like "Get your white supremacist BS out of here," and "No, Ben Shapiro, this our fight isn't about campus thuggery, it's about controlling the Trump-Pence fascist regime." Like, it makes no freaking sense, because you can't prove it. You just call people fascists, and then you dilute the meaning of the term fascist. You can't just cry wolf and call everyone white supremacists, like Tariq Nasheed and that dolt to me.
What Ben Shapiro is doing, I think, is the epitome of what needs to be done. What
Exactly.
he's doing,
He's going to where the opposition is. These college towns, extremely liberal, like UC Berkeley.
Yeah.
And he's saying, you know what? I want to voice my side of the side. My side of the side. My ideals, what I think. Even if you don't agree with them, what he's saying is he's giving you a platform to at least question it or at least view it.
Exactly, because no one is immune to criticism, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on.
Exactly.
Now, I wouldn't mind if, like, a liberal speaker such as Noam Chomsky went to somewhere like Fordham or Villanova or a very conservative Republican university, because then that way there is this kind of dynamic of criticism going on between the lecturer and the lecturee, and that's what is needed in today's society rather than safe space politics.
See, like, people, the two things that I think are amazing, right?
Yeah.
You had the person on the right, I'm forgetting. He had like glowing hair. He was a British accent. I forget what it was.
Milo Yiannopoulos?
He was so much better than Milo. Have you ever heard of Axis of Evil? It was an amazing speech. What was his name? But basically, like you were saying, no, actually, can you cover it for a second? Pause the thingamabobber.
What?
Okay, sorry about that. If I don't know a name or a fact, I need to like instantly look it up, and it was going to take us a second, so I opted to end the podcast for a second, or at least pause it. So the person that I was looking for was Christopher Hitchens. He is absolutely brilliant, and he is the counterpart on the right to what Chomsky is on the left. So I feel like that was the golden age of political discussion. They were able to host debates. They were able to voice their opinions. Noam Chomsky, extremely well respected. He goes out in the field. He does his research, and obviously he tends to lean on the right. Everyone on the left. Everyone has a leaning, and that's fine. At least he can defend it properly. He can defend it with facts. And he can defend it during discussion. Christopher Hitchens did the exact same thing on the right. For example, at some point he supported what's the thing where you put the mask on your face and then waterboarding? He supported waterboarding.
Oh.
He then waterboarded himself to see how if it was actually torture. He thought it was torture, so then he changed his opinion on it 180. Now, whenever Chomsky was met with facts, or whenever Hitchens was met with facts, they were able to switch their opinions. Now what we have is people who identify themselves by their opinion and by the supposed facts that they hold. That's why people like Trump and why people like Alex Jones are not able to hold a peaceful protest or a peaceful discussion. Because if they are questioned, they respond with vitriol and they respond violently and aggressively.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
And another example of people on the right and people on the left having a meaningful discussion and kind of having an interchange of ideas at a point where their worldview is more flexible and changed after the discussion is this very, very relevant and very, I think it happened like last year. It was an interview of Larry Elder on the Rubin Report hosted by Dave Rubin back when he was mostly leaning left, back when he was a part of the Young Turks, I believe it was. Yeah, so he was talking about police brutality in black communities, the shooting of unarmed black men, and then Larry Elder spat some spat some facts about
some bars in his face, man.
About the discrepancies of the Black Lives Matter argument that most black unarmed youth are killed by white cops. That is simply not the truth, as he was saying. I don't have all the facts. I don't even have the interview in front of me to pull up right now. But he was talking about how black-on-black crime in places like Milwaukee, Chicago, and these cities where crime is rampant in the hood, as it may be called, that essentially makes the white-on-black crime basically irrelevant. And white-on-white crime in terms of, that was our friend Ariman outside, but the white-on-white crime is also far far greater than white on black crime. And after that, Dave Rubin forever changed his stance on police brutality, not exactly to encapsulate what Larry Elder had told him from word for word, but he was very much influenced by Larry Elder's usage of statistics and just overall logic rather than vitriol, like what President Trump and Alex Jones and even people on the left use on a regular basis to make a point.
Yeah. No matter what side you're on, like you were saying, if you're able to support it with facts, or even more respectably, if you're able to admit that you don't necessarily have the facts and you're open to change your opinion, I think that shows someone that's respectable. That shows someone that should be a leader of a movement. Now, you mentioned, just to connect it to something more recent and relevant, you mentioned police brutality, right? I feel like someone who protested peacefully and properly with that would be Colin Kaepernick. Now, obviously, what was it? Donald Trump called people that protest during the sports events sons of bitches.
He said it yesterday.
He said it yesterday. And then you had the entire sporting community band together around this movement once again.
Exactly. In fact, today there was a game in England going on. It was the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Baltimore Ravens. I was watching that game, and it was the worst game ever. I think it was a blowout, like 44-0 when I came here to record this podcast. It was a terrible game, but even beforehand, you had people on the side of the Jacksonville Jaguars, and you had players of the Baltimore Ravens holding hands together and kneeling together. And then yesterday was the first time that a Major League Baseball player kneeled for the national anthem in its history. That is what you do when you force your kind of biased emotional worldview onto other people without really understanding what they're trying to conceive. And then what really pisses me off about the right, even moderate conservatives do this, and even many people on the moderate left do this, they equate kneeling for the flag with disrespecting soldiers and disrespecting members of the military. I don't see how that is not a straw man argument, because just because you kneel for the flag doesn't mean you're giving a middle finger to even the country, even the piece of cloth that you're kneeling for. I think what they're trying to do now, personally, I would never kneel for the national anthem or like not stand up unless, of course, no one's watching me and I'm at home eating popcorn watching the game, which is about 90% of the people who are opening their mouth about boycotting the NFL, so watch your privilege.
Like the same people, right, that say that we need to be able to, we need like people that protest are going against America, we need to support patriotism, stuff like that, right? These are the same people that will have like dirty American flags on their bumper, and like they're fine with having it disgraced in that way, right?
Yeah.
These are the same people that have it like tattooed. You're not, if you go to the flag code, by the way, you're not supposed to put on paper plates, napkins. It's only supposed to be used first and foremost as a flag. That's it. You're not supposed to decorate it anyway. So if you do use it in that way, and you're supporting the patriot argument, you're shooting yourself in your foot in terms of like moral high ground. You just can't make that argument. And I think like people protesting is not what we're going against. We're protesting people that are not doing it properly. So I mean, I don't really have much to say besides that. Do you have anything to say about protests from Trump until now? Colin Kaepernick apparently was brought up by the end. So like any protest related
Well,
ideas?
I think the apt way that I can at least think about concluding this topic is the fact that protesters on the left and the right, need to find refuge into one another in order to see a more peaceful outcome in the way that they can protest and in the way that they can go about social and political injustice going on in this country, because obviously we're not a perfect country. We have a lot of progress to make. But the only reason we can make it is if we hear out the other side. In fact, one of the most uplifting things that I saw from last weekend, I believe it was in the mother of all rallies. It was a Trump rally organized by tons of pro-Trump groups across the country that met, I think, in D.C.
Yeah.
And you had Black Lives Matter there. Now, the really, really crucial thing to remember here is that Black Lives Matter, unlike Antifa, they did not initiate any violence. They did chant, they did throw out anti-Trump slogans, but they did not get violent. And because of that, a bunch of pro-Trump Mother of All Rallies organizers invited a bunch of Black Lives Matter people on stage. And that was one of the most uplifting speeches that I saw. Now, I saw it a long time ago, but I don't remember exactly what he said. I did remember that at the end of it, the person in the Black Lives Matter, like the leader of that faction of the Black Lives Matter movement, he said the only way that we can find peace is if we listen to one another, and that's the only way that we can make a better country. And the pro-Trump people who are listening to that speech, predominantly pro-Trump, about 99% if you see the MAGA hats on everyone's head, you can see they were cheering for it. And that's one of the most uplifting things you can see in this day and age of divisiveness. A Black Lives Matter speaker speaking to a pro-Trump crowd, a pro-Trump rally, and everyone cheering for what he's saying. And even afterwards, that man, I forgot what his name is, he said that really lifted my hopes on what this country can become. And subsequently, the headquarters of Black Lives Matter called him a house N-word. Basically called him out. He said, no, he's not a real Black Lives Matter person. Tried to kick him out, couldn't, because he's the leader of his local Black Lives Matter group. But that just shows you what tolerance means in this day and age. When someone tries to show tolerance, when someone is given a stage to share their opinions on a certain issue and tries to unite both sides of the aisle, all of a sudden there are people who are much higher, like top tier people in that organization who will look to throw vitriol at them for absolutely no reason, because in this day and age you have to employ militaristic guerrilla tactics, you have to employ vitriol, you have to give it back even harder when you're hit hard. And that's the kind of rhetoric that divides our country. But it's events like that, a Black Lives Matter speaker in a pro-Trump rally, that really gives you hope about this country under a Trump presidency, no matter how disastrous it might be, and how flawed our country may be in this day and age. There is still vestiges of unity left over from where we left it at before this election cycle.
I think the story that Shan just gave is the perfect conclusion to this part. If I could just say one other thing, very short sentence, it would be that we need to stop identifying ourselves by our party and more by the fact that we're all Americans, that we're all people.
Exactly.
So we're just going to take a short break. We're going to pause the podcast for a second. Then we are going to be coming back with topic number 2, which is Executive Orders 13769 and 13780, otherwise known as the Trump travel ban.
Stay tuned.
Okay, welcome back. We are going to be talking about topic number 2, which is Executive Orders 13769 and 13780. Now, just before we go in, all Trump executive orders are going to be following 13 number. So we're just going to be referring to them by those last 3 digits. So if we say 769 or 769, that's going to be the initial executive order with the Trump ban. That's the first one, the one that he did right out the gate. And then there's also 780, which is what Trump called the, quote, politically correct, quote, version of his immigration ban. Now, if I could start off regarding the title of a Muslim ban or immigration ban, I don't think that people should be focusing on what it is called. Now, obviously, when the court trials go on, they're going to be focusing on that because that gets into a very legal area. But if you're talking about morals, if you're talking about politically, I think the more important thing to look at is what exactly does each immigration ban do. Now, when you look at the first executive order, what I think it did very poorly was it covered the wrong countries. Now, if it had covered countries that should actually be targeted, then I would agree. Like, if it had, the one country that I thought was the area that needed to be dealt with was Pakistan. I am Pakistani, and even I can admit Pakistan is a very hot area in terms of terrorism. Another country that was not on the list was Afghanistan, and what a lot of people focused on, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had most 9/11 terrorists were from Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden from Saudi Arabia. The king of Saudi Arabia has said that he supports radical versions of Islam. Saudi Arabia is clearly a cesspool, or at least an area. Okay, cesspool might be a stronger term. There's definitely a base of radical Islam in Saudi Arabia, but he didn't deal with that at all because he wants to get cozy. He wants to make deals, like he did with the arms deal. So the countries that were covered were Libya, Sudan, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Those were the countries that were covered. I think that's a good basic list. The way that it was implemented, obviously, that's going to be the basis of our discussion. But that's what it was. Now, I don't think anyone properly understands how intense it was at the airports at the least. Like, from what I heard, I'm not sure if you heard any stories, but my uncle, I told you about him, he was going to Canada, right? he does business in terms of selling rice, basmati rice. So he was in America. He was business meeting at New York. He was coming through JFK. He was not affected because he was coming from Pakistan. Pakistan just wasn't on the list. However, he saw people that were on his flight. I think one of them was Iraqi, and then two of them were Syrian, right? I'm not sure if they were. All I know is that that's their origin or nationality of origin. I don't think they were refugees. I don't think they were immigrants or whatever. I think they were just coming for a visit, to be quite honest. I'm not sure what their story is. But then they were held up, and they needed to get lawyers from the ACLU. The ACLU at this, I think I'm going on for a little bit, but the ACLU at that time was absolutely clutch in terms of providing legal assistance, in terms of providing lawyers, documentation, everything that they needed. So that was kind of my intro into the topic. I'm gonna pass on to Sean, so he can give you his initial opinions and his basic thoughts on the executive orders.
I really don't have much to add to that, to be honest.
sorry.
But
Sorry to put you on the spot.
yeah. No problem. I'll do a little bit more research on them just to add on to
Yeah,
what
for
you
quick,
said. But
but-
what do you want to continue?
Yeah, I got this. So, what I think is interesting is that Sally Yates, in terms of the first executive order, there's two ways you can look at it, but the first executive order is what I want to focus on initially. So that was the one where Sally Yates was like head of the Justice Department. She said, "I am not going to support this ban. I'm not going to tell my subordinates to implement it." She was acting attorney general, but the thing was, with each, even though people need to remember this, saying that you're acting or you're in the place of someone does not negate your rights to that position. For example, George Bush, when he was undergoing surgery, he made Dick Cheney acting president of the United States during that period of surgery.
Mhm.
Now, Dick Cheney at that time had complete power, and Bush did that for the explicit intent that if anything was to happen, there would be no question. So there's precedent, even at the level of president, there is precedent where if you have the term acting or if you have that role, you still have what you can do whatever you need to, and that's what Sally Yates did. Now, was her position politically motivated? No one can really know. Was it morally supported? I think the argument can be made very well that she was doing it within her rights as acting attorney general, and because she thought that it was simply not constitutional. If she was able to bring up certain parts, certain laws, certain pieces of the Constitution that said, yes, even though there's not been a court case regarding it, it's pretty. There's too much of a gray area to do something so stark and so drastic as that. And then what happened after that? People have called this the Monday Night Massacre regarding what Trump did. Now, that's obviously a callback to Nixon when he fired, during his investigations, he fired numerous people to try and ease the burden on him. But what happened was Sally Yates was fired. So Sally Yates, she was the acting attorney general. She's the number one. She's taken off. Then you have the demotion and replacement of acting immigration and customs enforcement director Daniel Ragsdale. So Trump instantly, he is showing a very bad beginning by just saying, if you don't agree with me, I'm not going to wait for the courts to settle this. I'm not going to wait for Congress. I'm not going to wait for anyone. I am going to fire you.
Mhm.
I think that set a horrible beginning to the presidency.
Exactly. And basically, Executive Order 13769, Executive Order 769 is what we'll be referring to from here on out. It banned the 6 Muslim majority countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia. Seven countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, because of the fact that there might be potential for state-sponsored terrorism on their behalf in a country in the U.S. in light of terrorist attacks that have happened in the U.S. and all throughout Europe. Now, this was struck down by several federal courts before it was upheld by the Supreme Court, by the fact that the president was allowed within his constitutional right as a president to ban countries for the sake of national security. The reason why people were, they felt betrayed by this was because of the fact that they're all Muslim majority countries, and the fact that Saudi Arabia was not included in this list, as Bilal previously mentioned, because of the fact that Trump wants to do arms deals. And it's not only about Trump. You have to understand that the military-industrial complex within the United States is a mechanized system built built to basically profit off of arms deals all around the world. Countries like Lockheed Martin, the government essentially acts as contractors of arms deals for companies like Lockheed Martin to deal in arms deals. In fact, I think there was a movie it starred Jonah Hill and this other guy who acted as arms deal contractors during the Iraq War that sold millions and millions and millions of unsolicited dollars to soldiers in Iraq to fight what was, the only way I can put it, pseudo-terrorism. I mean, President Bush had basically deployed them to fight terrorism, but as we all know, there were no weapons of mass destruction or any sort of gas used by Saddam Hussein against his people. Regardless of that, he was still executed in 2006. And because of that, you have to understand that it's Trump, as well as the entire mechanized military industrial complex that are overseeing and contracting these wars going on. In fact, the only reason why we're such good allies with Saudi Arabia is because of the fact that we can profit with we can profit with arms deals, and we get proprietorship of several of the oil rigs that are in the Middle East, not necessarily in just Saudi Arabia, but in other surrounding countries as well, especially Yemen, where there's currently a civil war going on between the Houthi rebels, the followers of a rebel, I think he was a militant who was against Saudi imperialism, essentially, in the Middle East. And it's basically the Houthi rebels against the Saudi Arabian government. And the Saudi Arabian government, being a rentier state, relies on arms deals with the United States, its biggest ally in terms of arms deals, to basically defend themselves, because they're a rentier state that only deals in oil and that profits off of the only natural resource of oil.
So that was a ton of information. I'm going to take a second to take that in, but obviously what Sean was basically hitting at was excluding Saudi Arabia from the list. There's no reason that it shouldn't have been on the list. The reason, as Sean pointed out, was because of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, we can't be naive about that.
It's pretty obvious. It was the military-industrial complex, and Trump wanted to look like a strong man. But we're gonna wage the fight on terrorism by supporting one of the nations that supports terrorism. Exactly. But the thing is, at least his base ate it up. We have been allies, supposed allies, with Saudi Arabia, and we're saying, oh yeah, Saudi Arabia has helped us fight in Iraq, and they've helped us counter Iran, which for some reason has been held up as a horrible nation, even though I'd say Iran is actually more moderate than Saudi Arabia, because at least Iran it's not a democracy by any means, but can you hold any semblance of elections? Yes. You can have, even though it's approved by the Islamic Council, even though the Grand Ayatollah needs to support it, out of like 600 people who file applications, like 7 can actually run for president. But the thing is, at least Iran can have elections. At least Saudi Arabia, as a monarchy, has made it so that they can't even support those elections. So when Trump was doing that, he banned Iran, who he just made a deal with, but who has agreed to stop their nuclear weapons programs, and by all accounts, by the United Nations, by the United States organizations that are overseeing them, they have. When he puts them on the list, but then he refuses to put Saudi Arabia on the list, who was actually one of the nations that started radical terrorism in like the 1980s. He shows his reason very clearly. Going
off of what you said, the reason why Iran is so antagonized by Saudi Arabia and the United States is because of the fact that during the revolution, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the fact that the people overthrew the Shah and created their own Islamic theocracy the way that they wanted it to be, the way that the majority of the people that resided in Iran wanted it to be. Saudi Arabia would never allow that, because they want an imperialist government, an imperialist state to perpetually rule over the people. So when the revolution happened, even Saudi Arabia's government was very, very much perturbed by the developments going on in Iran, because they feared that those same types of developments would go on in Saudi Arabia, which is why they cracked down on dissent, protests, and You know, that's why you had Wilbur Ross, who was our Secretary of Commerce, who was so perplexed by the fact that there were no protesters when Trump visited Saudi Arabia. Well, that's why, because they're not allowed to in
If
Saudi
you
Arabia.
protest, you're going to be killed.
Exactly, and that's basically why there's this proxy war in the Middle East going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That is basically you have battlegrounds for that proxy war going on between these two humongous countries in the Middle East, in places like Lebanon, Jordan, the biggest ones being Syria and Yemen right now.
And the only thing Trump is helping to do is propagate that.
Exactly,
It's all
by perpetuating and contracting arms deals for these countries to keep fighting with each other and profiting off of that. And this is what Eisenhower essentially warned against in the 1950s when he was president, because we're trading off humanity and lives for profit and for wealth creation of our country. Not even wealth creation, just wealth creation for the top tiers, the top levels of government, and their lobbyists and donors of Wall Street who get to privatize that and make money off of it.
It's so. I think when you don't have Turkey, when you don't have Saudi Arabia on it, don't even bother trying to say that just say what you want to do. These are the nations which we feel they're Muslim, and we're not going to be able to make any advantage, any economic gain off of them. Just put them on the list. That was very clear.
Yeah.
Now I think we've covered the content of it, and actually, there's one thing I would like to cover: the first ban. That was the one filed in January, 769. It had the two main parts of it were it suspended the entry into the U.S. for people from the 7 countries for 90 days, and on top of that, it placed limitations on the acceptance of refugees. So it wasn't just saying. It was not just saying we're going to stop people from these countries. It says if you're from these countries, you can't come in, and even if you're a refugee from any country, we're just going to say no. So that puts, especially now when there's areas where there's like terrorism being committed against Muslims or terrorism being like the main issue that for me that I feel like in the Muslim community is very relevant right now is what's happening in Burma. So what Trump said. There's obviously a good side and a bad side there, okay? Now, overall, world scale, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Muslims are committing more terrorism, okay?
Yeah.
But by placing this ban, he's basically saying Muslims in Burma, who are a minority, who are vulnerable, he's saying, you're not allowed. My bad. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
The door is closed for you. I think that's something that he did horrendously. Now, would you mind if I move on to the legal challenges?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Well, before that, I
go
just
for it,
want to
go
add
for it.
one thing. Trump actually issued a third quasi-pseudo travel ban a few days ago. In fact, that was issued by his government. It wasn't really a travel ban. Why I said pseudo-quasi is because it's not even a pseudo-travel ban. It's not really a travel ban
It
at
was
all.
like a reaffirmation.
It's a reaffirmation. It's basically the countries that he basically put on the travel ban, in addition to a bunch of other countries. Afghanistan was in it, I think.
Oh, finally.
Yeah, so basically, he said that you have 50 days to comply with our core set of biometric scans, communicate through electronic passport information, share information about terrorist and criminal networks with the United States that are already that are pre-existent in the countries that he's referring to. And if they fail to properly vet these people within 50 days, then they would actually face an actual travel ban, more of a limitation on refugees coming into the United States. It hasn't been sanctioned yet. The federal courts have actually upheld it for the first time that I have seen, because it wasn't as extreme as a complete travel ban. So that was a development a few days ago, because Trump just can't seem to not do stuff while we're out taking a break.
I know, like, I think that's actually a good decision by the Trump administration.
Yeah.
That sort of ban is what you need to be doing. He was basically saying, now obviously it's kind of a shrewd thing because he's trying to gather left support, I would say. Actually not even that, but anyway. What he's basically saying is, we're not going to ban your countries. We just want both sides, but also we've done our part. We want you to implement some more stringent and some necessary regulation on who's coming through. We just want you to vet the people better. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a perfect way to, if that was his first ban, if that was his first executive order, if that was 769, and then after that is legally upheld, he eases us into 769. I don't think it would have been a bad decision. I think the main problem was he did it too fast. He did it without getting both sides ready. Because that's what you need. You need cooperation. You can't just have
the United States say we're blocking everything, no one come in, right? If you had worked with the governments of these countries, or at least whatever semblance there is, whatever whoever's issuing the visas, whoever's actually getting them to the United States, if you had worked with them and you said, okay, this is what I want to do. This is the time frame I have. If you give me a 6-month time frame, if you can implement these scanners, if you can get some more thorough identification system, if you can vet these people better, maybe we can work something out. If we had someone with political clout, that would have been possible. Like if we had, for example, like a President John McCain or a president, I'm pretty sure Mitch McConnell would like to. At least Mitch McConnell, he's smart enough to be able to understand how to do this ethically. He knows what you need to do to be able to do this without getting it threatened not threatened, but challenged in the courts. Any other president would have been able, you could have a President Bush and he wouldn't have been able to do this. Anyone would be able to. He just didn't realize that you can't just go in. You can't go in raw, fam. You need some lube. How did I end that? Oh my god.
You said you were going to go into the legal challenges?
Oh yeah, legal challenges. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Not legal. Sean, you can't mention legal challenges. You need the loop. Okay. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, guys.
I'm in the loop.
Stop, Sean.
Oh boy.
I'm dead.
Oh boy.
Okay, so states that have had their state attorney general vow to oppose the order include, these are the major ones. These are where immigration is most likely to occur.
Mm-hmm.
So like countries or states like Vermont, like they had it, but that's not a major area where people go. So it includes California, New York, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Iowa. Those are like the big ones that I would care to mention. Massachusetts also did it. What I like, Minnesota actively opposed the order, but before even that, right? Washington not only had their state attorney general vow to oppose the order,
mm-hmm.
but they also challenged it. So there was the Washington versus Trump. That's the one that basically brought it to a halt. The state of Washington, so not just not one of the people that was affected, the state itself. After Sally Yates was fired, we're going to challenge this, fam. Buckle up, fatty. We're about to bring you to task. So then they're like, all right, fam, we are doing this now. Washington challenges it. Mm-hmm. It's still in like a limbo kind of state, but they were successful enough to where it stopped. So you have you had a couple of things that compounded. You had Washington versus Trump, which made headlines. Then you had the Sally Yates firing and the demotion and removal of Daniel Ragsdale. That's a PR nightmare. And then you combine all of this with various federal and circuit courts saying, we're not sure if this is constitutional, fam. Mm-hmm. For example, D.C., which D.C. Circuit Court is the most important one. They were like, okay, we're not sure if this is technically constitutional. For 769, that was death. So then, what Trump wants to do, he issues, and I'm going to read this out. I'm going to quote from Executive Order 780. This is what the executive order says. Quote, Executive Order 13769 did not provide a basis for discriminating for or against members of any particular religion. While that order allowed for prioritization of refugee claims from members of persecuted religious minority groups, that priority applied to refugees from every nation, including those in which Islam is a minority religion, and it applied to minority sects within a religion. Quote. So what Trump did with 780 was try and provide a legal defense. So 780, it was politically correct because he realized what he needed to do. We're going to be brought to court, and it was brought to the Supreme Court. It's pending. Yeah. So he was like, we need to create some sort of defense for ourselves as soon as possible. So in 780, the backlash is so bad. He needed to kickstart his legal defense. That's how bad it got for 769. Oh yeah, and then I'm going to quote. It looks like Section C. Once again, quote. On February 9th, 2017, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit declined to stay or narrow one such order pending the outcome of further judicial proceedings, while noting that, quote, political branches are far better equipped to make appropriate distinctions, quote, about who should be covered by a suspension of entry or of refugee admissions, end quote. So I feel the majority of 780 is basically saying, we need to like make sure we don't get torn apart. Because this was before. When was James Comey fired? Do you know that? Because that's the big
I
problem.
have absolutely no idea.
Um,
Yeah, while Bilal looks that up, another legal challenge for Trump's travel ban, I think it was the second one, 780, was the Hawaii federal court, which basically said that you should exempt grandparents who are cleared to travel with people who are citizens or are green card holders to the United States. They basically wanted clarification on the executive order as to whom is exempt from it, and they ruled on the fact that no one was exempt from it. They wanted at least grandparents to be exempt from it because the main contingency of the Hawaii federal court ruling was the fact that we are also responsible for people coming into this country, which is what essentially the Trump administration challenged, because they believe that we're only responsible for the national security of the country, not the fact that other people from other countries are coming here. And that was the big battle, basically. In this case, the Hawaii federal court won before it was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court, which sanctioned it because, let's be honest, I mean, from a conservative point of view, I can understand why people would think that the Hawaii federal court ruling was emotionally charged, because they believe that we have some sort of obligation and responsibility to caring for people whose relatives are coming to the country who are citizens of this country. Not the relatives, but like the
Family.
The family members, the bona fide relationship members, if I may say so myself, because that's what basically Trump had banned. He tried to ban that later, but that never passed because he knew it wasn't going to plausibly pass. The ACLU had already warned him from issuing it out because they would immediately challenge it.
Please donate to the ACLU, by the way. Whether you're on the left or on the right, I think we can all agree that the ACLU is an organization.
Yeah, and
that we
don't
support.
exactly, and don't think that the ACLU is a left-wing organization. In fact,
They support both sides.
They support both sides. The ACLU sanctioned the Unite the Right rally. Yeah, that might seem really like
They supported legal defense of it.
Yeah, they supported legal defense of it. They didn't think that it was plausible for people on the left to, or even the mayor of Charlottesville, to ban people who are taking part in Unite the Right. And even the ADL as well, the Anti-Defamation League, which is pretty notorious for banning Pepe from internet,
What
from
legend.
the
What
internet.
legend.
That didn't work, obviously, because we're not idiots. But anyway, even they defended Ben Shapiro. They labeled him as the number one most attacked person, not even conservative or liberal person, from white supremacists and neo-Nazis and the KKK on the far right. So definitely organized to these groups because they're definitely not left-wing. They support both sides as long as it's defensible.
Hands down, throughout this entire ordeal, the ACLU was providing. In the initial phases, like they were supporting the immigrants so beautifully. There's a picture that I saw. They were working at a table in McDonald's in one of the airports, and all these people are like huddled around to provide legal support. That is true America. That's like true America.
Yeah, lawyers like sitting in tables, lawyers who aren't even suited up, them getting their phones, laptops out to help people who are affected by this travel ban after it caused chaos in airports. That's the America that I know. The America that helps people who are in need in this country, who are not looking to cause harm or malice to this country, because that's who we truly are.
That's weird.
And that's not just coming from a Unitarian point of view, this kind of like imagine John Lennon point of view where everything can be utopian, but we do have aspects of care in this country that seeps through both sides of the political aisle. Like one of the big examples is the guy sitting right next to me and me.
Oh my! Damn me up. There we go. You were talking about John Lennon. My personal favorite Lennon is Vladimir. Okay.
True.
True. Never forget, the only reason communism messes up is because it's communism. I mean, that's the only reason. I mean, come on, honestly. Okay, so that was completely random. Okay. Anyway, on June 1st, in terms of legal challenges, that was when the Trump administration appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So now this is the outcome of what happens in Supreme Court. I think it's going to be extremely interesting because nothing of this scale has ever happened before. Like the last time that we had this massive amount of immigrants coming in at once during a period of war was during Vietnam. We had massive amounts of Vietnamese, of Cambodian immigrants coming to the United States. What we did then
I think I'm almost positive it was Guam. I'm like 90% sure it's Guam. But we set up temporary areas where they could go to Guam. We would screen them there on U.S. territory, and then they would be brought in stateside. I think a similar method should be done now. Now, obviously, we would need to work alongside those nations, alongside the United Nations, which I think should be done. But Trump is in a corner right now. It's not looking good for him at the Supreme Court. Even though on June 26th, the Supreme Court partially lifted it.
Yeah.
So technically, it's in play, but like it's irrelevant. Like the
I just think that they
politically irrelevant. Like
politically, but I think the only thing that they did was rescind the bona fide kind of a corollary that was in the executive order. They just said, I don't think that that's necessary to implement. That was in response to the Hawaii federal court ruling, by the way.
Yeah, like with the Hawaii federal, like when they appealed, or when they brought it to the court, I think the parts that were the parts that were lifted, were the parts that everyone could agreed upon were within his legal jurisdiction. Now we're looking on is, can the president? It's obviously in his right to control safety in the United States, but isn't it in Congress? Pause the thing for a second.
1 second,
Sorry,
folks.
guys.
We're
This always
doing
happens. Sorry.
some intermission research. We'll be back in 2 seconds.
Sorry. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I need to look. I'm going to be doing this very often. Both of us are going to be like, if we ever need to look up something, we're just going to pause it for a second. Sorry for that interruption. But now that we're back, it is under Congress's power to look at immigration. They are the ones able to pass legislation. Now, in terms of implementation of that, do you think the president should be able to, at least, if not completely like pass executive orders that are bounding, should they be able to influence immigration? Should they be able to like put their own spin on what Congress has done?
Wait, are you talking about the executive branch?
I'm talking about like, in terms of passing legislation that deals with immigration, right?
Yeah.
It's under the control of the legislature of Congress, right?
Yeah.
But should executive orders, right?
Yeah.
They're meant to do what they're meant to be. They're basically meant to be resolutions that say, "This is what I need to do to fulfill my duties," right?
Yeah.
So, do you think that passing an executive order that has some sort of legislative support, should it be upheld? So basically, if I'm saying this, if let's say it's the exact same ban.
So if the president wants to take it into his own hands to implement immigration policy, if he sees it as feasible, legally feasible.
Not quite. So if you let's say you had instead of Executive Order 13679, right? Let's say it was HR 679, right? And it was passed by the House, it was passed by the Senate,
Okay.
and then Trump passed the executive order to be able to fulfill it, right? Do you think that would be legally defensible? Or do you think the fact that it was only done by executive order? So is it a moral issue of the topic and constitutionality?
Yeah.
Or is it just by the method by which it was done and passed?
I think it was by the method, because it's definitely constitutionally feasible, because the fact is that the president has the power in order to defend national security from any quote-unquote illegal aliens or undocumented aliens that come into this country that may potentially harm the kind of sovereignty and national security of the country. So he has the there is no argument as to whether it's constitutional or not, other than the way that he did it.
I think an argument can still be made about is the resolution, is the ban itself, not the order, not the law, is the ban itself constitutional? I think that would either way, that would still be done by the courts. I think what people are getting their like pennies in a twist about is you can't just pass an executive order that's so broad sweeping and so dramatically.
The fact that it was broad sweeping is the reason why many people thought that it was unconstitutional, as they should have, because of the fact that it's so broad. There's no legal consensus as to why he banned these specific countries, because historically there has been statistical increases in U.S.-bred terrorism from people who came from countries like Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia. That's the biggest sponsor of terrorism in this country, but he still banned countries like Somalia, whom we haven't gone to since 1992 or 1993, I believe it was, under the Clinton presidency, and that was when Black Hawk Down happened. So they're basically irrelevant to us at this point in time.
That was during a civil war.
That was during a civil war, which, I mean, there's
terrorism during any civil war. That's
exactly.
Just kind of,
there's still terrorism, the domestic terrorism going on in Somalia, but I don't believe that it's legally binding to ban them just because of the fact that we think they might come and terrorize us. We don't have any legal consensus or like any statistical consensus over that. And same goes to Libya as well, even though we did interfere with with basically the Libyan state in 2011 when we decided to go in and infiltrate and basically initiate the Arab Spring. The hardest hit nation unarguably was Libya.
yeah, like why are we? If he really wants to stop terrorism, which he supports, right? Get the right nations, like you were saying. Don't get nations like Somalia, which are not really causing terrorism in the United States, or they're not at least sending the people that cause it, right?
Yeah.
You need to attack it two ways, right? Attack the right countries and attack the right people domestically. So like domestically, you have people, if you want to go Islamic terrorism, San Bernardino. That's homegrown terrorism. There's been homegrown terrorism all across Europe. What you need to do is attack those roots of terrorism. And then on top of that, attack terrorism that's coming from overseas, like Saudi Arabia, like Pakistan, like Afghanistan. So that's what Trump is trying to do now. He's trying to cover his own tracks, trying to make it seem like, oh yeah, this is completely illegal. But even before you do that, with an executive order again,
Yeah.
make sure that you get it passed by the legislature. Because you need to work with the legislature to get something like this done. Yes, it is in your power to implement it, to protect the United States in the boundaries that Congress has set. So no matter what, there's going to be a legal challenge, but at least make it look like you know what you're doing. What he did, in my opinion, seemed like he was kind of like just trying to pump up his ego. Like, yeah, I can do this. I have the power. And then it got shot down. It blew up in his face. In terms of the executive orders, to be quite honest, I don't think. Do you think that this leads to a more imperial presidency? Like FDR, for example, he's my personal favorite president, but there is no doubt in my mind he threatened at numerous points American democracy. Somewhat hypocritical, yeah, but every president that has been seen as great threatened. Like people hold up Jackson, Lincoln.
Yeah.
Lincoln threatened American democracy by suspending habeas corpus.
And due process, yes.
And due process, right? So Lincoln, he was a great president.
Yeah.
But was he a morally good president?
That's on legal issues.
Yeah. Like if there was let's put it this way. Let's say Lincoln is like...
But the thing about what you said about Roosevelt and
Yeah.
Lincoln was when they imposed their... Like when
Yeah.
Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in due process.
Wartime.
And when... Yeah, wartime. And then when FDR put the Japanese in internment camps... By the way, I'm not defending any of this. It's like...
We're just stating the facts.
It's horrendous. Yeah,
We're giving you some real talk.
Yeah, we're giving you some real talk. He putting the Japanese in internment camps, banning Jews that came into ships to flee war-torn Europe and Nazi Germany. That, I don't believe it did lead to an imperialist presidency, did it? Because I think imperialism led to statutes like Manifest Destiny under William McKinley, under James K. Polk, who wanted to acquire new territory in what we now know as the American West. And that's what led to even presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, who gave the moral argument as to why we should save, with air quotes I put there, the people of the Philippines, and we need to take them under our wing.
Yeah.
That's when the real kind of imperialist United States started taking over, late 1890s, early 1910s. And I don't think before that, because under Lincoln and FDR, we were a country in wartime. We found ourselves in wartime, whether it be Civil War or a World War. So I don't think you can make a grounded comparison between those presidents and even now with the travel ban, because there hasn't been enough of a development to judge as to whether or not this will make us into a more imperialist, even heading into a country that has imperialist tendencies.
The one thing I want to mention, I'm not talking about obviously we've had portions in or times in our history where we wanted to expand our power, our influence, and our territory and the continent. What I mean by the imperial presidency was this idea that grew up during FDR, that there's too much power concentrated in the executive branch. So during the administrations of Wilson, of Hoover, right? The executive, even though they tried to pass laws, and even though they supported stuff like like voting for women, right? So like they were able to like push that through, but they didn't have broad sweeping powers. They didn't have the various departments which fall under the executive branch, right? So before FDR, you have a very limited executive branch that's basically the figurehead of the nation.
Mhm.
Post FDR, you have a massive, and I'm talking about, it is probably the biggest of the three branches in terms of who follows it. Like the Department of Justice,
Mhm.
they serve at the pleasure of the president because they're part of the executive branch.
Exactly.
That kind of ended with Nixon. So with the rebirth of the imperial presidency, do you think once again there's too much power concentrated in the executive branch?
With the executive orders, well, it's kind of been a recurring theme since the era of George Bush, even the kind of era of executive orders issued by the executive branch to expand the powers of the executive branch. I don't think it's anything new. It's been a pretty worrisome trend that we're kind of funneling more governmental power and imbalancing the checks and balances system of the government to weigh the scale more towards the executive branch rather than the other two branches. I believe that it's not a trend that starts with Trump. It has started with a bunch of presidents in the post-Reagan era.
It kind of builds up and then it
It
collapses.
builds up and then it
builds up
collapses.
and
Exactly. It's
I get like the imperial presidency. I think is such an interesting topic. Like you
Yeah.
have Jackson with like the nullification crisis. He
Exactly.
he was the big dog. Lincoln imperial presidency that kind of collapsed during like the third party system.
Yeah.
Then you had the imperial presidents. I would say were Jackson, Lincoln, FDR, Nixon, and now possibly Obama. I think Obama he blew up the power
Yeah.
because he continued what Bush was doing. Bush had a reason to. Whether you agree with it or not, we were actively at war.
Yeah.
Obama in like 2010 and 2011, the wars started to tame off. Then he used the Arab Spring as an excuse to bump it up once again.
Exactly.
And so now Donald Trump isn't creating this once again. He's just using the left was fine with it when it was on our side, when we agreed with it politically. Now that the tables have turned, the left finds reason to say, oh, no, this isn't legal. But you created the basis for it. You allowed for this to happen under Obama. So, to be quite honest, I don't have anything else to say. Do you have anything to say regarding the executive orders, travel ban, imperial presidency?
I think you summed it up pretty well. It's topics that we can't sum up in, like, obviously the time that we're allotted to. But
like these
it's
conversations could go on for like you could have a podcast on the imperial presidency alone.
Exactly. With that being said, I think that concludes the second episode of Real Talk with Shan and Bilal.
We will be coming back to you hopefully within the next 1 or 2 weeks. Next episode number 3 of getting us up to speed. My bad. Is going to be disorderly cabinet. Wow, my mouth is completely dry. Can't speak. Topic number 1 is going to be House of Tards. That is going to be dealing with the various firings and removals from the Trump administration. And then topic number 2 is going to be construction and deconstruction of the cabinet. So next time we're going to be all in to just the executive branch and what it takes to actually run the White House in this day and age. So thank you guys for watching. We hope you come back and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Real Talk with Bilal and Shan.